The horn on the river pressed through the fog like a slow hand against glass, and the kitchen held its breath. Salt clung to the window frame, a white crust along the grain I sanded years ago. The kettle began to mutter. I rinsed the blue teacup with the chipped rim, my mother's teacup, and the china chimed once against the sink, a bright, guilty sound. In the hall, his voice moved low and certain. "Front room for my parents. The living room will work for Eleanor." He said it softly, but certainty has its own volume. The air stiffened. The kettle found its heat and trembled. Somewhere in my ribs, something did the same. Silence remembers. I do too. Only special people, my mother used to say, get trusted with a home. I stood very still. Laura slipped in with night shift eyes and the sterility of the hospital still clinging to her coat. She kissed my cheek and smelled like soap and fluorescent lights. "You're always so understanding, Mom," she whispered and looked past me toward the hall. Understanding. It's a gentle word with a hard edge. I set the teacup on the sill and watched the river fog try to come inside. I heard him laugh once, soft managerial. Plans were already laid. "The house remembers what we forget," I said, though only the sink heard. "Front room," he'd said. "Not my room. Not the room I framed with my hands when the pink dress hung tiny on a nail, Laura's dress, drying in the winter heat of the old stove. Heat rose now for a different reason. The kind that lives under the sternum and knocks to be let out. I wrapped my hands around the kettle, as if warmth could write a new story into my skin. Evan ended his call and leaned in the doorway like the house belonged to his shadow. "We'll just make it work for a few days," he said. "Few days," the favorite hymn of long takings. For a few days I repeated tasting iron. "You're good with people," he added. "Only special people can carry family like you do." I nearly smiled at the theft. The line was my mother's. He wore it like cologne. Laura's eyes asked me to let it pass. Tired love does that, it asks you to bend so things won't break. A boat horn groaned again, and somewhere in the foundation the old beams answered. I poured tea. The chipped rim pressed a little crescent against my lower lip. I saw the hallway in a long, low perspective, the way you see a dock when you've walked it 1,000 times. Each board knows your weight. The phone call told me enough. Enough as in the end of a rope, not the start of a story. "Your parents are welcome," I said finally. "My bedroom is not." It might have ended right there if the world were kinder to boundaries. He smiled that manager's smile, the one that files every sentence into columns. "We'll talk later," he said, as if the decision were already stamped. Laura reached for my hand. "Please, Mom, just until they find a place." "Find a place," I repeated and heard the echo inside the wood. "We all need to find a place." I took a breath the way a diver takes one before the river closes, slow, deliberate, prayerful. Today the living room is theirs. The front room stays mine. The words stood up straight and faced the door. "If you felt this kind of silence, tell me below. Would you have done the same?" After they left the kitchen, the clock went on with its soft clicks each second, a tack into the wall of morning. I wiped the window. Salt dust kissed my palm. Only special people I heard again, my mother's voice braided with the steam. She said it the first time I drove a nail clean the head, flush the grain uncracked. She said it when she taught me to check plumb by listening to the spirit of a wall, and she said it the day we brought home that pink dress, years before the dress became a memory I kept folded with the linens. Silence remembers. My hands remembered how to hold a cup and not shake. He moved furniture that afternoon, the way men in a hurry move other people's air. The couch scuffed the floor. I heard rubber against oak. I heard a picture tilt and stop. I heard the house take it like a body takes news it never asked for. When Laura returned with fresh groceries and careful cheer, the doorway framed her like a portrait of compromise. "They'll only bring a few things," she said. "Things multiply when doors open," I answered, and rinsed the cup again, though it was already clean. She rested her head on my shoulder. "You've always been the soft place to land. Soft is not the same as weak. Soft is where strength chooses to be kind." I stood in my doorway at dusk and watched the river turn pewter. Lights came on along the bridge, one jewel at a time. The living room smelled like cardboard tape and good intentions. He positioned a folding cot and called it temporary. I took the old brass key from the hook and felt the notches remember my thumb. The door to my room swung with that loved low sigh it makes in damp weather. I stepped in. The floorboards creaked once in greeting. My husband's level waited where it always lives on the shelf by the window. Enough, I said to the room that knows my real name. The word fit. The air warmed. Heat this time felt like courage. Would you share this if you believe silence deserves a voice? Follow family revenge stories for more real healing. Later I made tea and stood in the shadow between lamp and window. Through the glass I could see them laugh at something small and kind. I'm not immune to the ache of love holding two truths at once. They were trying, and they were taking. Both can happen in the same hour. My chest understood both languages. I lifted the cup and the chip found my lip again, a small bite that reminded me of edges. The house settled. Old wood always does 1,000 secret muscles releasing what they've held all day. At the center of my chest, a map unfolded. One road led toward fury, loud and righteous. It promises quick relief, rarely delivers peace. Another road led toward the old bargain swallow smile surrender. That one delivers praise, not respect. A narrow path ran between them, unpaved and honest. I could see it clearly as the steam curled past my face. A key in a palm, a simple lock, a door that only opens inward. The house remembers what we forget, I said for real this time, and the sound of it calmed the kettle of my heart. Heat softened into warmth. Warmth found a voice I knew. Here is what my body knew before my mouth did the moment you call something yours. It calls you back. The beams answer. The paint brightens. Even the dust behaves. My room had been waiting for me to speak its name. I set the cup down on the dresser on the ring my husband's coffee left a lifetime ago, and pressed my hand to the wood until I felt its slow pulse return mine. The pink dress flickered across my mind, tiny stitches I made by lamplight, patient and proud. I am still that woman. She never left. Night gathered like thick wool along the river. I switched off the lamp and let the dark be kind. Somewhere in the living room, cardboard sighed under blankets, and a promise sagged under its own weight. No one meant harm. Harm had arrived anyway on quiet feet wrapped in the word temporary. I stepped back into the doorway, the brass key warm now against my skin. I held still until my breath matched the breath of the house. Silence remembers, not to punish, but to keep us true. I walked to the kitchen one last time, passing the framed photograph where we stand in front of fresh lumber, younger and foolish and invincible. The salt line on the window caught the streetlight and turned to silver. I lifted the teacup and felt how small a thing can be and still hold a life. Evan's voice drifted in from the other room, confident already arranging tomorrow. Laura's murmur answered a braid of hope and habit. I listened to all of it, and to the thing beneath it. The river horn carried across the water like an old warning, slow and low. I placed the cup on the counter, ready to sleep behind a door that bears my name. I did not slam, shout, or sermon the room. I let the decision sit where it belonged, simple as a key, steady as a beam. The cup touched the wood and made a bright, small sound that felt like truth-finding daylight. I wanted to say the rest out loud, but the house had already said it for me. I set the cup down. It spoke. I didn't. The scent of sawdust still lives in the back room, sweet and dry, like a hymn that never learned new words. Morning light slants across the bench I built, pointing at old pencil marks, little ticked prayers along the edge. The radio on the shelf gives only static now, salt having crept into its throat. I run my fingers over the vice jaw and feel nicks like braille. This was my corner once, a square of noise and purpose. Then one day a glossy monitor arrived, then a humming tower, then cables like vines. Small things, small steps, small doors opening inside my house. Silence remembers, so does the wood. And wood tells the truth even when people don't. It started with kindness, or what wore kindness like a coat. "We'll just put the printer here," he said, and smiled as if asking. The plug went into the wall, and I felt the room inhale something not mine. Later, the router blinked all night, tiny green eyes patrolling what used to be my dusk. "You're so easygoing," Laura said, laughing into my shoulder. "Only special people are." She meant well. Love often does. but the words landed like moths that came to stay. I stood there, palms dusty, and saw my outline fade from the floor where I always stood to sand, like someone erased with a clean rag. Next was the garden. The roses I trained along wire like gentle students finally learned my hand. Each spring they opened with a shy brightness, as if the soil remembered a promise. A little platform, he said, measuring with his phone, not a level. Just enough for a car and a pallet or two. Enough. There's the cinnamon in the pie, the sliver that becomes a slice. The day they laid the deck, the thud of each plank settled into my bones. The perfume of cut cedar fought with the breath of crushed petals. Heat rose through my chest, not weather, not menopause, but the old stove of anger finding dry kindling. I said nothing. Silence remembers. It also burns. "Mom, you adapt better than anyone," Laura told me that evening, folding dish towels I stitched in younger years. I looked at my hands and found the map of their work. The thickened pads where a chisel taught me patience, the crescent scars from careless screws, the faint ghosts of varnish that never truly leaves. I thought of the pink dress again, the hem I'd turned while the baby slept, the thread wet with my breath to find the needle's eye. I used to believe the dress would grow with us if I held it gently enough. But fabric thins, seams let go without asking permission. And some goodbyes are just the sound of a drawer closing. One night, Evan set a metal rack in my kitchen because the boxes need air. Boxes always need air. People need space. He had a way of saying temporary that sounded like forever wrapped in polite paper. "Don't worry," he said, as if worry were a choice I kept making. "This family is a team. Team is a kind word when one person writes the playbook." I dried my teacup with the chipped rim and saw the crack extend a hairline vein reaching for the lip. Heat again low and certain, moving through my ribs. I remembered my mother's hands turning a board to the light. "Find the grain or the grain will find you." I tried to speak once. "Could we keep the bench open?" I asked, touching the place where my husband's level used to sleep. He blinked like the router. "I already promised my supplier," he said. "They think we can scale." Laura's smile tried to hold 3 worlds at once, my world, his world, and the world where no one fights and no one cries. "Just for a bit, Mom, just for a bit." The ballad my house now hummed. I swallowed the word enough, and it lodged under my tongue like a seed that refused to sprout. If you've felt this kind of silence, tell me below. Would you have asked for the bench back or let it go? In the mirror that hangs by the pantry, the one with the silver peeling like winter bark, I saw a woman soften at the edges. Not from age. Age can be thunder and bone. From 100 courtesies that slowly smoothed her into something decorative. I took out the teacup and set it where Dawn could find the chip. The crack had lengthened almost tender, like a delicate river on a map. "Only special people," I whispered to the empty sink, and I knew my mother meant trust, not sacrifice. I remembered the night I lifted the pink dress from the line, and it smelled like rain and milk. Heat rose then, too, but it was life returning, not dignity departing. I walked out to the deck that used to be roses and leaned against the post. The river moved like a sleeping animal's shoulders under a wool blanket. Trucks from the warehouse sighed along the distant road. I listened to the house breathe through the vents, the way a long-married lover keeps a rhythm, even when dreams are rough. "The house remembers what we forget," I said softly, and the phrase did not feel like poetry. It felt like a measurement. My concessions had a length, a width, a depth. If I stacked them, they would reach the ceiling and press down the air. Share this if you believe silence deserves a voice. Sometimes time needs a witness. Awareness arrives like a door you thought was a wall. You press lightly and it opens on oiled hinges, and suddenly you are standing in a hallway you built and abandoned. I saw every nod I gave in the name of peace. I saw each small yes parade toward a larger no I never said. I saw Laura's fear, honest and human, of becoming the villain in her own marriage. I saw Evan's certainty, smooth as laminate covering the imperfect pine. I saw my own retreat step by quiet step until I was a picture frame holding other people's faces. Heat climbed my throat. Enough, it said in a voice I recognized as mine. I went back to the workbench and laid both palms flat. The grain under my skin felt like a heartbeat patiently waiting for the doctor to give it a name. I thought of the early winters, the stove ticking as it cooled, my husband teaching me to hear when wood is ready for stain. You don't rush finish, you wait for what the board wants to be. Somewhere between patience and surrender, I had misplaced myself. But wood forgives, houses forgive. They hold your place at the table even when you've forgotten you're hungry. Silence remembers yes, but it also keeps a chair pulled out. The evening came red along the water, a thin stripe of warning between banks. The router blinked, the boxes breathed, the deck cooled under a sky of gulls. I carried the teacup to the sink and felt the crack with my thumb. A flaw can be a story if you hold it to the light. That's what my mother told me the day a bowl slipped from my hands and learned gravity's temper. "We'll mend it," she said. "We'll line the break with gold when we're ready." I am not ready for gold, but I am ready to name the break. The kitchen lowered its voice as the lamps came on. I could hear my granddaughter's laughter upstairs, and that sound is a ladder I never stop climbing. I could hear Laura's shoes whisper tired on the hallway runner, guilt catching her heel. I could hear Evan counting something in his head numbers that moved like dice instead of prayers. I exhaled into the room I built and felt it exhale back. "Enough," I said, and this time the word did not hide. It stood between me and the rack between me and the deck between me and the next small surrender dressed as love. The night settled easy on my shoulders as if it still knew my shape. I wiped the rim of the cup and set it down where dawn could visit again. Outside the river kept its slow promise toward the sea. Inside I kept mine to myself. The bench would be cleared, the roses would return, or maybe they wouldn't. But I would. The house remembers what we forget, and it is reminding me whose name is carved in these beams. Soft is not weak. Quiet is not surrender. Peace is not the same as absence. The afternoon hung heavy thick with coastal damp. Every window wore a skin of breath, the kind that fogs truth before it settles. The kettle had stopped hissing, yet the heat lingered in the room, that kind of trapped warmth that doesn't comfort, only waits. I dried the blue teacup, the one with the chipped rim, turning it slowly in my hands until my thumb found the rough edge. That edge had always told me when enough was enough. I set it in the center of the table, a witness, a line, a memory that would not look away. "Sit down," I said softly. "Both of you." Evan and Laura exchanged glances, that quick marital glance that hides agreement behind love. They sat. The wood groaned under the weight of what wasn't yet said. I let the silence shape the first word. "This room," I began, "is mine." The word mine tasted foreign, too sharp for a mouth that had learned compromise. I breathed once, twice, letting it soften into something true. "Your father and I built this house with our hands. Every board remembers us." Evan smiled that half smile of diplomacy and folded his arms. "It's just temporary," he said, "the way a salesman softens a no." I leaned forward, the old wood pressing cool beneath my palms. Temporary, I told him, is a word people use when they're planning permanence. The air thickened. Even the light seemed to hold its breath. I could smell the tide through the window cracks, salt metal, and something old like the ghost of patience leaving the room. Laura reached for my hand. "Mom, we just thought it'd be easier." Her voice trembled on easier. The word floated there, paper thin, and tore itself apart. I pulled my hand back gently. Easier for who? No one answered. Only the clock dared to move its second hand, scratching time into the silence. "If you felt this kind of silence, tell me below, would you have done the same?" I looked at them, my daughter, her husband, and saw not cruelty but convenience, the kind that wears polite faces and speaks in softened tones, the kind that erodes ownership grain by grain until a woman becomes the furniture she dusts. Evan's voice broke the stillness again. "They've already packed, Eleanor. They're bringing just a few boxes." Just a few boxes, that's how an empire begins. One corner, one shelf, one just... "Did you tell them to pack?" I asked. He hesitated, eyes flicking toward Laura. They needed to know where they'd sleep. "So you decided," I said, "for me." He shifted in his chair as if my words had found the wrong angle in his spine. Laura's voice came smaller. "We didn't mean to make you feel left out." "Left out," I repeated. "I'm still inside this house. You can't leave someone out of what she built." The cup between us caught a sliver of light and reflected it back, a fragile blue echo across the table. I thought of the pink dress again, the one Laura wore at 5 years old, hem brushing her knees, hands clutching my apron as she spun. Back then, her laughter filled every room like music that refused to fade. Now, it filled the spaces between apologies. "The house remembers what we forget," I said quietly. Evan frowned. "What's that supposed to mean?" "That every wall here knows my name," I said, "and they'll repeat it when I'm gone." He looked away, muttering something about how I was making this harder than it needed to be. Harder, another soft word hiding a blade. I had spent years choosing quiet over storms. I thought quiet meant peace, but silence isn't peace, it's storage. It holds everything until the weight demands sound. "You call it temporary," I said, rising from my chair. "But what you're really saying is you've already decided." Laura's eyes shimmered with guilt or fear, maybe both. "We thought you'd understand." "I do," I said. "That's why I'm drawing the line now." I touched the cup, tracing its rim once more, the chipped edge now catching warmth from the lamp. "You can host your parents," I continued, "but not in my room, not in my name." Evan exhaled sharply, a puff of disbelief. "You're making this about territory." "No," I said, calm as the tide outside. "You made it about permission." Silence stretched long enough to grow roots. The house itself seemed to lean closer, listening for whether I'd break the way I used to. I didn't. "If you've ever had to choose between peace and dignity, share this with someone who needs to hear it." He stood. "We'll figure it out," he said, voice clipped managerial again. "You'll discuss it," I corrected, "not figure it out. With me, not around me." Laura's chin trembled. She nodded, small, reluctant human. For the first time, her eyes didn't plead for calm. They searched for understanding. There's a difference. The moment passed like a match dying, not loud, but final. I sat again, hands on the table, and looked at the cup still standing between us. The hairline crack had widened since morning, faint but certain. That's how boundaries form. Not in noise, but in fracture. "The house remembers what we forget." I whispered again, softer now. Less warning, more truth. The phrase no longer belonged to the house. It belonged to me. Evan gathered his phone and papers. Laura wiped her cheek. When they left, I stayed still, steady breathing through the taste of salt and resolve. I didn't feel victorious, just returned. Sometimes reclaiming space isn't a battle. It's a remembering. A woman sitting in her chair saying no without apology. A teacup standing guard in the middle of a table, the light catching its wound like a promise. When the front door closed, the sound rippled through the walls, soft as the sea against old wood. The house settled, recognizing its rhythm again. I touched the cup, felt its warmth fading, and thought there's a kind of peace that doesn't smile. It just stands. Would you have spoken up? Or kept the peace a little longer? I lifted the cup and placed it on the counter, right where the light meets the shadow. The silence hummed its approval, the kind that feels like breath returning to lungs. Boundaries don't shout. They hum. They stand like tide lines on old sandproof that water came and water left, but the shore stayed. The air felt lighter. I could hear the faint creak of the floor settling under my feet, the sound of something remembering me. My voice was barely a whisper now. "Lines are meant to hold," I said, "not to hurt." I looked once more at the cup. It gleamed quiet and loyal. "The house remembers what we forget." I repeated, then smiled, small and sure. Boundaries speak when we finally do. The line has been drawn, and I only repeated it. The cold came early, sliding along the baseboards like a careful animal. The river's breath pressed against the panes until each one fogged and sighed. I could smell damp wool, old soap, and a faint iron tang from the radiator. The house dimmed itself to lantern light, every shadow learning my name again. I held the brass key in my palm until the metal took my heat, then turned it once in the lock. The bolt answered with a clean, honest thunk. On the other side of the door, the hallway paused, listening for me to change my mind. I didn't. Silence remembers. I turned the key again. Night lay down and the house began its small languages. Springs murmured, pipes clicked. In the living room, Evan unfolded a thin mattress with the bored patience of a man arranging boxes. Fabric scuffed the floor. Tape peeled like a quiet hiss. From the stairwell, Laura's voice lifted and fell soft as steam. "Grandma needs to rest, baby." I could hear Mia answering words run together by drowsy teeth. I laid my cheek to the wood I hung decades ago, felt the hinge line up like a heartbeat under a rib. Kelp salt from the river laced the air. My room smelled like cedar shavings and the last chapter of a book. I dragged the trunk from under the bed, the one with the leather straps thin to velvet. Dust lifted, turned silver, and settled again. The lid creaked with that faithful note only old hinges know. inside quilts stacked by seasons, a photo wrapped in waxed paper, an envelope addressed in my husband's patient hand. Beneath them, the small oak panel he carved with a hidden groove. He used to smile when I found it every time as if it were magic. Only special people he'd say and kiss my forehead like it was a blessing. My thumb found the groove by memory more than sight. The panel slid. There it was. The slim folder, tied with twine, the color of dry grass. Our deed. The insurance papers. The original survey with his pencil notes along the margins, little arrows pointing to the maple and the well. My name and his name braided on every page. My pulse slowed to meet the paper's patience. I pressed the stack against my chest and felt the heat come back to my hands. Heat not from anger this time, but from ownership waking in the blood. I slipped the folder beneath my pillow like a child hiding treasure, then sat with my back to the door and listened to them living on the other side of it. Evan coughed that dry warehouse cough he carries home, and the cot complained under an unfamiliar spine. Laura's steps made a ribbon to the kitchen and back. Water filled a glass. A whisper. Another. Plate against counter. The refrigerator's old motor tried and tried, then found its rhythm. I let each sound pass through me without stopping to build a story around it. That's how a boundary holds when sound can exist without permission to enter your bones. Enough, I breathed so quiet even my own ear had to lean in. The word lay down at the threshold and went to work. I thought of the pink dress, of course. I always do when doors close. The night I hemmed it, the house smelled like starch and cinnamon, and the old stove made a soft ticking that matched Laura's new heartbeat. I hemmed in circles slow as prayer, because some garments insist you meet them at their pace. Now the dress lives in a cedar sleeve small as a wish the world hasn't outgrown yet. I pictured it hanging in the closet behind me, a quiet flag of all the times I opened doors for love. Love gets to visit. It doesn't get to rename the rooms. If you felt this kind of silence, tell me below, would you have locked the door or left it ajar? The mattress shushed again, then stilled. Mia's feet pattered down 2 steps, stopped, then climbed back up after Laura's hush. I waited until the house changed keys, until the night's music dropped into its low register. Then I turned out my lamp. The dark was not empty. It was kind. I could still see the rectangle of the window, the river a darker stripe beyond it, as if the world were a book closed for safekeeping. I slid the brass key under my pillow with the papers and lay on my side palm to the wood floor. The planks had widened this year a hair, enough to let the room breathe, enough to let me. Would you share this if you believe silence deserves a voice? Follow family revenge stories for more real healing. Sleep came in pieces like shingles laid by a careful roofer. I dozed, surfaced, listened, and sank again. In one wakeful stretch, I heard the tide turn in the river, an old slow swivel that makes every piling groan. My chest answered it. Something in me had been pushing upstream for years, out of habit, out of duty. Now it loosened, turned, and let the current bear part of the weight. Not all, just enough to remember I had a spine without needing to prove it. Heat spread beneath my shoulder blade, then settled like a cat that chose me. Awareness is gentle when you let it be. It doesn't slam a lesson into you. It sets one next to you on the nightstand. I woke to the feel of paper edges against my forearm, that catechism of thin, stubborn leaves. The deed did not ask for my belief. It carried it. The house remembers what we forget, I whispered, and the phrase no longer sounded like a warning. It sounded like a blueprint, a simple door, a simple key, a simple woman speaking a complicated love in simple ways. This is mine, and I am still me inside it. Sometimes boundaries are loud like thunder. Tonight mine was quiet like a door well hung. I didn't need to argue with the hallway or justify the lock to any witnesses. The cold did not complain about the seal. My hinge didn't creak to be dramatic. It held because it had been measured, sanded, and set with care. That's all. A boundary is good carpentry. You plumb it to truth. You shim where life isn't square. You close it and feel the latch find home. And then, you rest. Near dawn, the house shifted to that almost silence where every small thing announces morning. The radiator breathed a little harder. A gull tried 3 cries, gave up, and coasted inland. On the other side of the door, Evan turned in his sleep, a single restless sound from a man who believes comfort is a language he's fluent in. Laura whispered Mia's name, a dream correction that softened into a kiss against a sleepy crown. I placed my hand flat on the door again. Warm. The grain lifted under my palms, swollen with the night's moisture. The wood had grown like I had just enough to be felt. When the alarm on Laura's phone pipped tiny apologetic, I sat up, smoothed the papers, and slid them back into their secret place. I tucked the key into my dress pocket and stood in the blue light that comes before sun when the room looks like memory made gentle. My knees spoke a little complaint. I answered with a slow stretch, thanked them for their service, and promised them coffee soon. The window held a thin arch of cloud, the kind you can blow away with a hopeful mouth if you're 8 and mighty. I smiled toward that thought. I opened my drawer and found the ribbon from the pink dress, just the little tail I saved without thinking years ago. The color had faded toward rosewater, almost shy, almost not there. I looped it once around the brass key, like a soft flag that belonged only to me. Heat moved through my fingertips when the ribbon tightened. Not anger, not warning. Heat like life choosing the body again. In the near light, the key scratches looked like handwriting. Maybe mine, maybe his, maybe the house's. I pressed my ear to the door and heard nothing that demanded me. Only breathing. Only the long patience of wood. Only the kind of quiet that doesn't erase you. It frames you. When you hold the key, I ask the morning, do you hold yourself again? The room answered by standing exactly where I left it, loyal as a dog that forgives your errands. The lock waited, not jealous, not proud, just ready. The kettle would want tending soon. The day would make its lists and hand me 3. There would be conversations and rearrangements and the first of several honest apologies. There might be pushback. There might be gratitude. I could meet all of it without losing my shape. I touched the key in my pocket and felt the ribbon whisper against brass. The house remembers what we forget. The hinge breathed. The bolt glowed a dull, friendly gray. I set my shoulders and smiled toward the wood. The door locks. I open. Morning arrived slow and pale, the kind that doesn't rush to open its eyes. Light sifted through the curtains, soft as flour. I could hear the kettle beginning its faint complaint, that gentle hum before the boil. The air smelled of toast and quiet tension, the kind that sticks to walls long after voices stop. The dining table had 3 cups waiting, 1 chipped porcelain, 1 thin glass, 1 mug with a faded lighthouse. Steam rose from mine, tracing ghosts in the sunlight. The crack on the rim glimmered faintly, a scar catching firelight. I watched it breathe. Tea first, truth later. When I turned, they were already seated, Carol and Frank, looking like polite strangers in someone else's home. Their coats were too neat for comfort, hands folded as if waiting for permission to exist. Evan sat beside them, face a little gray, pretending to scroll his phone. Laura kept her gaze low, her eyes swollen from a night of trying to make sense of me. Or of herself. No one spoke. I poured tea into the chipped cup, the sound filling the room with something almost human. "Would you like milk?" I asked. My voice came out steady, low, a tone learned from years of smoothing sharp edges. Carol hesitated, then whispered, "Just a bit, thank you." The word thank you cracked in the air, fragile, misplaced. Steam rose between us, and I realized the table itself felt like a battlefield disguised in linen. Every spoon placed too gently, every sip a negotiation. Amal. Then Carol said it barely audible, but clear enough to tilt the morning. "We thought you'd agreed, Eleanor." My hand stopped halfway to the sugar bowl. The heat from the cup licked my fingers. Agreed. I looked at her, not angry, not yet, just searching for what she meant. She blinked, looked toward Evan. "He said you were happy to let us stay in your room. That you insisted, actually." I could feel the pulse in my neck, slow, deliberate, counting down. Evan's shifted eyes fixed on the table. "No one asked me anything," I said. My voice came quiet, almost gentle. Least of all him. The words sat there plain honest and heavier than I expected. Silence pulled up a chair. Laura's eyes shimmered, 2 apologies too late. Evan cleared his throat. "Mom, I didn't want to worry you with details. It's just details I cut in. You mean decisions?" His jaw tightened. It was easier that way. I smiled, a thin, careful line. Easier for who? He didn't answer. He didn't need to. Carol looked at me, then really looked. Her hands trembled against the tablecloth. "Evan?" she said, voice small but clean. You shouldn't have said that. That was the moment the air changed. The tension cracked not loudly, but enough for the truth to slip through. Frank, silent as a gravestone, finally spoke. We don't want trouble, Eleanor. We were just told you'd offered. I didn't, I said, and I'm not offering now. If you've ever had to claim your space in a room you built, tell me below. Would you have poured the tea anyway? Carol exhaled, shoulders folding with something like relief. Then we'll find somewhere else. Her tone carried both regret and understanding. Laura whispered, Mom, please. But the words had no destination. I touched the chipped rim of my cup again, still warm, still loyal. The crack hadn't spread. Neither had I. The house remembers what we forget, I said softly. It knows who carried the beams, who sanded the floors. It knows whose hands bled for it. Evan's face stiffened. That's not fair, he said. Fair, I echoed. Fair would have been asking me. He pushed back his chair, the sound harsh metallic, then left the room without another word. For a long time, only the ticking clock dared to breathe. Then Carol reached across the table and rested her hand near mine, not touching, just close enough to say, I see you. I'm sorry, Eleanor, she whispered. He shouldn't have lied. You deserve better. The words landed like rain on scorched ground. I nodded once, slow, deliberate. Steam curled between us, turning the air into forgiveness I wasn't ready to name. I poured her another cup. Tea's hot, I said. Yes, she smiled faintly. But truth burns longer. Her eyes drifted to the window, to the frost glinting along the sill. We'll leave after breakfast. You'll eat first, I said. No one leaves my house hungry. We sat quietly after that, not as enemies, not yet as friends, just two women holding opposite ends of a mistake. If you felt this kind of uneasy peace, share this with someone who might understand. Laura returned from the kitchen carrying toast she didn't eat. Her hand brushed my shoulder when she passed. I'll talk to him, she murmured. I know, I said. I just hope he listens. Mia's laughter drifted faintly from upstairs light, unbothered, innocent. I let it wash over me, the sound of a house still alive. When breakfast ended, chairs slid back in slow unison. The table looked bare again, but not empty. Carol gathered her gloves, paused at the door, and turned. Thank you for the tea, she said softly. I met her eyes. You're welcome, I replied. It's good to know where everyone stands. She nodded, and for a moment she looked younger, or maybe I looked older. Either way, something small had shifted back into place. After they left, I stood alone in the quiet. The sunlight had climbed higher, painting the rim of the cup gold. Steam rose again from the cooling tea, thin but stubborn, refusing to fade. The air smelled faintly of sugar and honesty. I could still hear Carol's voice echoing under the rafters, you deserve better. The house hummed in reply, soft approving. I touched the chipped porcelain once more and smiled. Cracks don't always mean weakness. Sometimes they're proof of endurance. The tea was cooling, but the truth still burned. Tea hot. Truth hotter. The morning light came through thin as gauze, the kind that doesn't warm, only reveals. Dust danced slow above the staircase, catching on every forgotten edge, each speck a tiny reminder of what time takes when no one looks. The kettle had long stopped singing. The house hummed in its own rhythm, the tick of the wall clock, the faint creak from the attic beam, the ghostly echo of a child's laugh still clinging to the hallway. I held the phone against my chest for a while before I dialed. Sometimes even numbers feel heavier than memories. Ruth, I said when her voice answered, just her name. My sister's voice still carried that calm steadiness I used to borrow from. Eleanor, she breathed. You sound like someone who's been holding her breath for too long. I need to breathe, I managed. There was a pause, the kind only sisters know how to fill. Then simply, come here. Stay a few weeks. Spokane will hold you better than that house right now. Her words didn't ask. They wrapped around me, a soft command made of love. I looked around at what I'd built. The railing still smoothed by years of hands. The glass smeared with Mia's fingerprints, each one an echo of joy, too young to understand betrayal. The smell of tea leaves gone cold, everything ordinary and suddenly unbearable. If you've ever looked at your home and seen both safety and suffocation, tell me below. Would you have left or waited until it was too late? I set the phone down gently, its receiver clicking like a clock closing an hour. Then I began. The first suitcase came from the closet under the stairs, the one that still smelled faintly of cedar and my husband's old aftershave. I folded 3 sweaters, 1 pair of jeans, my nightgown, the wool scarf Ruth knitted years ago. The rhythm of packing steadied me, 1 breath per fold. Leaving doesn't always begin at the door. Sometimes it begins in your hands. On the table sat the blue porcelain cup, the one with the chipped rim, its wound soft now from use. I wrapped it in a square of linen, then a layer of flannel, and finally the fabric box I once saved for keepsakes. My fingers moved slowly, tracing each layer, as though wrapping a heartbeat. The box closed with a muffled sigh. It wasn't just porcelain I was packing. It was proof I could still protect something fragile. The air in the house changed, not louder, not heavier, just aware, like it knew. When I walked past the mirror, I almost didn't recognize her, the woman standing there with resolve tucked into her collarbone. There was a time when I would have mistaken resolve for bitterness. But this was something quieter, cleaner, the kind of calm that comes only after every storm has had its turn. The house remembers what we forget. I could hear it in the boards under my feet. The same floor that carried laughter now carried choice. I returned to the trunk under my bed, the one that kept the deed, the folded secrets. But this time the folder looked different, thicker. I lifted it, and a smaller envelope slid free from beneath. The paper was stiff, official, heavy with the weight of men's ink. My name stared back from the corner next to a notary seal. Power of attorney, dated 3 months ago. The signature, mine. Only it wasn't. The curl of the E was wrong. Too confident. Too smooth. My handwriting always trembles at the end of a stroke, as if still listening for permission. This one didn't hesitate. Heat rose behind my ribs, the kind that doesn't burn, just reminds you you're alive. I sat on the bed holding the paper, watching it blur at the edges. Evan, it had to be Evan. All that politeness, all those soft words, they'd been rehearsals for this moment. It's just temporary, he'd said. Now I understood what he meant. Temporary until I stopped noticing. Would you have called it betrayal? Or just family being family? If you've ever had your trust borrowed without asking, share this with someone who might need to hear it. I folded the paper once, then twice, then slid it back into the envelope. The ink still smelled faintly metallic. I placed it on the dresser beside the box with the cup. For a long time I just sat there, the quiet thick around me, the kind that holds both fury and forgiveness. There's a strange peace in discovery the moment you realize you were right to feel uneasy. It doesn't soothe. It clarifies. Outside the sky had begun to snow, thin flakes twisting sideways against the light. I thought of Ruth's porch, the smell of pine, the hum of her kettle that never scorched the water. For the first time in years, I wanted to walk toward something instead of away. The house remembers what we forget. It remembered every word spoken in half-truth, every document slid under light too dim to question. It remembered me when I'd forgotten myself. I touched the box again. The porcelain cup waited inside, wrapped like a promise. I thought of Mia's tiny hand on the window, the streak she'd left when tracing the frost last winter. Grandma, she'd said, "Why do doors make noise when they close?" "Because they want to be remembered," I'd told her. Now I understood my own answer. I took the suitcase by the handle. It felt lighter than truth. When I reached the front door, I turned back once. The house stood still quiet, but not empty. Every corner seemed to breathe walls, forgiving me floorboards, whispering good luck. The radiator sighed like an old friend. "I'll be back," I said softly, "but next time I'll bring peace with me." I locked the door not as an ending, but as a vow. Then I slipped the key into my coat pocket and walked toward the morning that waited behind the frost. The snow met the air in silence like secrets finally free of gravity. The house remembers what we forget, and I remember now who I am. I didn't sign. Who signed me? Fog draped the Astoria Megler Bridge like an unfinished thought, thin and restless against the steel. The bus engine hummed beneath my feet, steady, indifferent. Each vibration passed through the soles of my shoes, through my knees into my hands where I held the small fabric box. Inside it, the porcelain cup lay wrapped and quiet, trembling, just enough to remind me that nothing, not even porcelain, is truly still. The air smelled of diesel and wet salt. Outside, the world vanished every few seconds, swallowed and given back by the fog. Between Oregon and Washington, there was only gray. Only the sound of leaving. Only me. I pressed my palm over the box as the bus jolted across another joint in the bridge. The porcelain shifted a faint click like a heartbeat, remembering itself. I watched the outline of the bridge rail disappear into nothing and thought maybe that's what healing looks like. Losing sight of the shore, but moving anyway. The letter was folded inside my coat pocket. My handwriting wavered, but the words stood tall enough. "Laura Evan, I'm not running. I'm giving you space to grow into silence, to face what you built without me holding it up. The house is yours to fill or to lose, but it remembers what we forget. If you've ever left to save yourself not from others, but from who you became beside them, tell me below. Would you have gone or stayed another day hoping for change? The bus climbed the last slope of the bridge. Through the fog, the faint outline of the Washington coast appeared gray on gray, like an old photograph trying to come alive again. The road curved, the tires hissed on wet pavement, and I let out a long breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. Freedom doesn't sound like a shout. It sounds like exhaling on a moving bus with nowhere to rush to and nothing chasing you. I opened my purse for the first time that morning. Inside was the envelope from the trunk, the one with the forged signature. The edges had softened from the humidity, but the seal still pressed its truth into my skin. I ran my thumb along the curve of the E, the wrong E, and smiled without warmth. Whoever signed for me didn't understand the weight of a name. A signature is a small promise between a person and their own life. You can borrow ink, but not intention. The bridge disappeared behind us. Fog swallowed it whole, leaving only the hiss of the road and the slow rhythm of the driver's radio. In my lap, I unfolded a napkin from the cafe where I'd stopped earlier. I wrote one line on it. Sometimes love hides inside control. Then I folded it again and tucked it into the fabric box between the cup's flannel layers, not to protect it, but to remind myself what not to forget. By the time we reached Spokane, the sky had turned pale gold, the kind of color that forgives the night. Ruth was waiting by the terminal door, wrapped in a wool coat 2 sizes too big, her arms open before I even saw her face. Look thinner," she said into my hair. "Just lighter," I whispered. We didn't talk much on the drive to her house. The heater rattled. A pine-scented air freshener swung from the mirror, its rhythm matching the slow hum of tires over frost. The town passed in small glints bakeries, not yet open dogs turning circles in backyards, smoke curling from chimneys like small prayers that hadn't learned to rise higher. That night, Ruth made soup, the kind that smelled like childhood, heavy with time and quiet forgiveness. We sat at her kitchen table, steam rising between us, her cat pretending to sleep on the counter but listening to every word. When I finally began to tell her about Evan, the forged papers, the house, she didn't interrupt. She just listened, her eyes steady, her spoon unmoved. When I finished, the silence between us didn't feel empty. It felt earned. Then she said softly, but certain, "You've mistaken being kind for being small, Eleanor. You've confused peace with permission. You've been quiet long enough." Her words landed without ceremony, simple, sharp, true. I looked down at my hands, older, steadier, no longer trembling. For years I had built a life out of endurance, thinking that if I just waited long enough the storm would pass. I never noticed that I had become the weather myself, calm gray and always giving way. If you've ever realized too late that your softness became someone else's comfort, share this with someone who might still be waiting to wake. Later, as she washed the bowls, Ruth said something that stopped the air. "Your son-in-law called last spring," she said. "He asked strange questions about your house, about the mortgage, the title. I thought it was just curiosity." I froze. The words hung in the kitchen like frost on glass, beautiful, cold, dangerous. It wasn't just a forged signature, it was a plan. I sat back, the chair's wood creaking softly under the weight of truth. The steam from the sink turned her face to watercolor, her profile fading in and out through ribbons of heat. For a moment, everything blurred: the house, the bridge, even the hurt. "The house remembers what we forget," I murmured. Ruth turned, drying her hands on a towel. "Then maybe it remembers who signed for you." That night, I lay in the guest room under her quilt, a patchwork of blues and small, stubborn reds. Outside, the pines whispered against the glass. I thought of the bridge again, the way fog had hidden every mile between what was and what could be. Maybe that was mercy. Some truths arrive only when you're far enough to see them clearly. I reached for the fabric box beside me. Inside, the cup rested like a heartbeat that refused to stop. I touched the lid, and warmth pooled in my palm. Heat, not anger anymore, just life returning. I closed my eyes and pictured the bridge stretching between 2 coasts of the same woman, the one who stayed and the one who finally crossed. The house remembers what we forget. The bridge remembers too. A thread of fog, a thread of truth. Morning light filtered through Ruth's lace curtains, thin as truth. The world outside was pale, brittle, the kind of quiet that makes even clocks hesitant to tick. Ruth stood by the window, holding her cup, the way some people hold worry, carefully afraid to spill it. Across the table sat Mrs. Delgado, her glasses perched at the tip of her nose, the smell of peppermint tea tracing the air between us. The folder lay open. My name sat there, bold and black, stamped on paper that should have felt like mine. Only it didn't. The signature, she said, sliding the page closer, is supposed to be yours. Supposed to be. The word cracked somewhere deep. Her magnifying glass caught the morning light, bending it into a perfect circle over my name. The ink looked thicker than memory, confident in all the wrong places. I stared at it until the lines began to blur. The E was too proud, too sure of itself. No tremor, no pause, none of the small humility that lives in my hand. My voice came out steadier than I felt. That's not mine. Ruth reached across the table, her fingers brushing the edge of the paper. I know. Mrs. Delgado nodded, calm and practiced. It's a durable power of attorney. Filed 6 months ago. Witnessed and notarized. The witness was a friend of your son-in-law. The words fell in slow motion. 6 months. Friend, son-in-law. Each landed like a cold stone on still water. Would you like us to request handwriting verification? She asked. I almost laughed, that strange, airless kind of laugh that never reaches the throat. Yes, I said. Let's give the truth its own lawyer. The magnifying glass rested over my name again, the lens trembling slightly as Mrs. Delgado adjusted it. In the circle of light, the signature looked smaller, as if the paper itself wanted to apologize. If you've ever seen your trust stolen not by a stranger, but by someone you fed loved, raise tell me below. How does one grieve for respect? Mrs. Delgado took notes with a fountain pen that whispered against the paper. The document allowed him to use your property as collateral. There's a second loan, signed in your name. I looked up. How much? Enough, she said softly, to buy a fleet of trucks. My hands began to shake, not from weakness, but from awareness finding its rhythm. He started a company, I whispered. A transport business. She nodded once, under his name. But the collateral is yours. I pressed my palms flat on the table, grounding myself in its solid wood. The house remembers what we forget, I murmured. Ruth's voice cut through the stillness. He took your roof to build his ladder. Her words hit harder than she knew. The lawyer's office smelled of peppermint and ink, but I could still taste salt, the kind that comes from realizing you were the last to know. I thought of Evan's smile, that polite curve of lips he used when lying wasn't quite lying yet. The way he said temporary, like a promise dressed as patience. And I remembered all the times I'd told myself not to overreact, not to make trouble. Every silence I'd offered had been an open door for him to walk through. Would you have done the same? I asked the heir. Would you have trusted family just because the blood says so? Mrs. Delgado looked at me over her glasses, eyes soft but sharp. This can be reversed, Eleanor, but it won't be easy. Families protect their own even from the truth. I'm not asking for protection, I said. I'm asking for clarity. That was the first moment my voice felt like mine again. We spent the rest of the afternoon combing through records. Every page was a confession made by someone else's hand. A neighbor's signature here, a notary's stamp there. Each line confirmed what I already knew, but hadn't dared to say aloud. I wasn't losing my mind. I was losing what was mine. By evening, the sun slipped low, turning the glass of Mrs. Delgado's desk into liquid amber. I leaned closer to the magnified text. The lens caught a reflection of my face, lined older but not defeated. Beneath the warped glass, my name shimmered like a wound catching light. This isn't about a room anymore, I said quietly. It's about ownership, of a life. Mrs. Delgado looked at me for a long time, then closed the folder gently. You have a case, she said, and more than that, you have proof. Proof. The word filled the air like oxygen. When Ruth and I stepped outside, the air bit at my cheeks. The sky had gone from gold to ash clouds, stitched across it like unhealed scars. She linked her arm through mine, her warmth steady grounding. We walked in silence for a while, the kind of silence that doesn't hide, it holds. Finally, Ruth said, You know what hurts the most? Not that he forged your name, that he thought you'd never notice. I nodded. People forget that even silence keeps receipts. She laughed, low, rough, a sound born from both fury and love. If you've ever been betrayed and felt both anger and relief at once, share this with someone who needs to remember their own voice. Back home, I sat by Ruth's window, the magnifying glass still in my purse. The light from the street lamp made it glow faintly, its reflection trembling on the wall. I thought of it as an eye that never blinks, truth's own instrument watching when we don't. I took out the letter I'd written to Evan and Laura. I hadn't mailed it yet. I read the last line again. I left to let you grow, not to give you power over what I built. Maybe it was time to add another line. I am coming back and I am not alone. I folded the letter neatly and placed it beside the magnifying glass. Then I closed my eyes. The sound of the ocean far away now found its way into my breathing. The house remembers what we forget, and now so do I. The lens, the truth, my name. Not just a room, a right reclaimed. Rain whispered against the windows, fine and steady like fingers drumming on an old wound. The house smelled of coffee and damp wool. I had opened every curtain so no one could hide behind the dim. Around the oak table sat what was left of a family, Evan and Laura, my daughter Carol, her husband Frank, and Ruth at my side. The porcelain cup, chipped but polished, rested at the center of the table. Beside it, the report folder and one blue pen, 3 points forming a quiet triangle. The air held its breath, so did I. "I didn't call you here to argue," I began. My voice was slow, calm, too, even for comfort. "I called you because the house deserves the truth." No one spoke. Only the rain answered, soft, relentless, impossible to ignore. I reached into my bag, unfolded the document Mrs. Delgado had verified, and laid it flat beside the cup. The pages curled slightly from humidity like they didn't want to be read. 6 months ago, I said a paper was signed in my name. Not by me. By someone who said they were doing it for family. Evan's face paled, then stiffened. His eyes darted to the page, then to me. "Mom," Laura started, her voice trembling. I raised a hand. "Let me finish." My hand didn't shake, not this time. "This signature authorized a loan against this house. My house. The same roof that held your first Christmas, your daughter's first steps, your arguments, your laughter." I paused. "Evan, you signed for me." The silence after that sentence was heavy enough to move air. Evan swallowed. I did it for us, for the business, for the future of this family. For the family, I repeated, each word weighed like a stone. "You took my name to buy your dream. You risked my home to prove your ambition." He looked away. Carol pressed her fingers to her lips. Frank whispered something that sounded like regret. Laura's tears came without permission, her breath hitching between disbelief and guilt. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I didn't know." "I know you didn't," I said. "But silence has its own signature too, and it signed plenty." I pushed the folder toward the center. "Here's the truth. Certified, notarized, undeniable. If you've ever had to confront the people you love, not with anger but with proof, tell me below. Would you have spoken or stayed quiet to keep the peace?" No one moved. The rain grew louder, 1,000 small verdicts falling on the roof. Then I began clearly, one sentence at a time. "This is what happens next. The power of attorney revoked. The debt repaid in full. You'll move out within 14 days. You'll write a letter of apology by hand and read it aloud before both families. And finally," I paused, letting the weight of their eyes settle on me, "you'll take a financial accountability course, every week, until you understand that trust has a cost." Frank looked up first. "That's fair," he murmured. Carol nodded slowly, her face streaked with quiet grief. Evan's jaw tightened. "You're punishing me." "No," I said softly. "I'm teaching you." He clenched his fists. "You think this will fix anything?" "It will fix me," I replied. "That's enough." For a moment, he looked like the boy I once met on Laura's wedding day, proud, uncertain, desperate to impress. Then something in him broke. He pressed his hands to his face. "I didn't mean to hurt you." I believed him. That didn't make him innocent. The cup caught a drop of rain from the ceiling, a small leak from the storm outside. It rolled along the rim, pausing at the chip, and stayed there, trembling, stubborn, refusing to fall. I stared at it. That tiny droplet was every woman I've ever known holding, bending, but not breaking. If you've ever stood in a room full of people and felt alone in truth, share this. Because silence remembers. It always does. The pen waited on the table. I placed it in front of him. "Write your first word," I said. He hesitated, then took it. The sound of the nib scratching the paper was the only sound left in the room. Ruth sat beside me, her hand steady on my wrist. The air softened. Even the rain eased its rhythm as if listening. When he finished, he didn't look up. His voice cracked when he said, "I'm sorry, Mom." I nodded, not in forgiveness, but in acknowledgement. Some apologies are maps. They don't erase the distance, they only show the way back. Later, after they left, the house felt lighter, though the air still smelled faintly of wet paper and remorse. I stayed at the table, tracing the outline of the triangle cup document pen. Past proof possibility. The house remembers what we forget. I thought of the bridge that morning, of how fog once hid the truth until I was brave enough to cross it. Outside, the rain slowed to a mist. I could almost hear the house exhale. Vizetting even had said, "For family." But family is not a license, not a reason to trespass the soul of another. Love is boundary, not permission. The house remembers what we forget, and I remember what is mine. I lifted the cup, watched that one drop finally fall. I didn't sell the house to buy a lesson. I earned it. The hammer fell softly, one measured strike on Mrs. Delgado's wooden desk. It wasn't loud, but it carried the same weight as a door closing. Outside, rain tapped the window like fingers trying to get in. Delgado's pen moved with quiet authority, signing, stamping, finalizing. The motion was almost musical, a rhythm of consequence. Across from her I sat still, the cup of tea untouched before me, the steam rising and fading, like old anger losing its heat. "It's done," she said. "The power of attorney has been revoked. The bank's been notified. Your property is protected." I nodded the words slow to land, and Evan, he signed the repayment agreement this morning, 1/3 of his income each month until the debt is cleared. I closed my eyes for a moment. Justice has no triumphal sound, only quiet completion. Later at the bank, I watched the manager seal the envelope, pressing it flat with his palm. A final stamp. Then the document slid into the archive drawer with a metallic click. One chapter closed, not with applause, but with precision. If you've ever fought for fairness not with anger, but with steady breath, you'll understand. Justice rarely roars. It whispers enough. That night, I came home to the smell of sawdust. The old workshop had been closed for years, its shelves layered in dust like a second skin. I turned on the small radio in the corner, an old jazz station humming low. The music filled the silence with a rhythm that felt familiar, steady, human, imperfect. I rolled up my sleeves and began to clear the space. The wooden mallet hung from its nail, its handle smooth from decades of use. I took it down and tapped the workbench once, slow, deliberate, like punctuation. The sound echoed softly, then settled into the house. I built a small shelf for Mia that night, just wide enough for her storybooks and drawings. She'll visit this weekend. I want her to have something that's hers untouched by adult mistakes. When she comes, I'll tell her stories about this place, how her grandfather built the first chair here, how the scent of pine meant beginnings, not endings. She's the one thread that stayed untangled through all of this. Love doesn't always survive conflict, but sometimes innocence does. Laura came by after sunset. I heard her car door close, hesitating as if guilt could make sound. When I opened the door, she looked smaller than I remembered, not by height, but by weight. "Mom," she said quietly, "can I talk?" We sat by the window, the one that still catches the sea breeze from the west. "I was afraid," she said. "Afraid of losing him, of being alone. I thought if I supported him, I'd keep the family together." Her words trembled, but not from weakness, from truth trying to breathe. I reached for her hand. "You were trying to protect something that was already safe. You just couldn't see it." She looked down, eyes shining. "Can you forgive me?" Forgiveness, I've learned, isn't a single moment. It's a discipline, a boundary wrapped in grace. "I'm working on it," I said, "and you will too." She nodded. "I will. If you've ever carried guilt heavier than intention, tell me below." Sometimes confession isn't about being heard. It's about no longer being silent. When she left, I made tea. The kettle hissed, the water trembling like the breath before a sigh. I poured it into my chipped cup, the same one that sat in the middle of that long, hard meeting. The crack along its rim glimmered faintly in the kitchen light. Imperfect, but strong. The roof creaked with wind, the same old sound I used to mistake for loneliness. Now it felt like breathing, the house reminding me it was alive, that I was too. I sat at the table and wrote a line in my journal. Some walls protect, some teach, some forgive. Then I drew a small circle beside it, a symbol of return. The house remembers what we forget. It remembers laughter, betrayal, correction, and now a softer kind of peace. I walked to the workshop one last time before bed. The hammer lay on the bench, its head cool against the wood. I lifted it gently, tapping once again, not to build, not to end, just to mark the rhythm of survival. 3 slow beats, past, present, possible. Justice had been delivered, but what mattered more was the quiet after the silence that didn't ache anymore. Outside, the rain stopped. The night stretched open, deep, and forgiving. I whispered to no one in particular, "Love isn't free. It asks for truth." Then I turned off the light, leaving only the sound of the roof breathing. Forgiveness is conditional, family disciplined. The morning was gray quiet as parchment. Rain slid down the kitchen window, tracing slow rivers across old glass. The air smelled of wood polish and damp cedar, the scent of a house that had weathered too much, yet still stood. On the counter, a chipped cup waited beside a folded volunteer form. The ink had smudged overnight. I remember thinking, maybe that's what justice looks like after the storm, imperfect, but written with steady hands. The police officer spoke gently over the phone, his voice wrapped in procedural calm. He said they could press charges, forgery, fraud, misuse of elder property. His words were clean, legal hollow. Then he asked, "Do you want to proceed, ma'am?" Outside a car passed through the puddle, its tires sighing. I looked at Mia sitting in the corner, cradling the old doll I'd once sewn for her, the one with a missing button eye. I didn't answer right away. I just watched her tiny fingers smooth the doll's hair the way my mother once smoothed mine. I thought of Evan, of the boy who once built birdhouses in this same yard, proud of every crooked nail. Somewhere along the way, the boy had disappeared behind ambition, behind the word family used as a shield. Carol's hands shook when she brought me tea. Laura's eyes, sunken, sleepless, searched the floor instead of my face. They were all waiting for a verdict, and for a moment I wondered who I was to deliver one. "Ma'am," the officer said again. I could almost hear the pen waiting to click on his end of the line. I closed my eyes and said no prosecution. A pause, longer than I expected. Then I added, "But there will be consequence." When I hung up, the house sighed deep, low, forgiving. It remembered all our dinners, our storms, our silences. It remembered what we forget. That night I met with Delgado. She adjusted her glasses, skeptical but kind. "Are you sure?" she asked. I nodded. Justice isn't breaking what's already cracked. It's teaching someone how to hold what they dropped. She smiled faintly, wrote a few notes, then slid a paper toward me. The volunteer registration for Evan. 200 hours at the senior center. I signed at the bottom the same way I once signed permission slips when he was a boy. And this time my hand didn't tremble. Later, I set the chipped cup beside the paper as if the two belonged together, lesson and legacy. Mia peeked over the table. "Grandma, is Uncle Evan in trouble?" I smiled softly. "He's going to learn." "That's different." She tilted her head, trying to understand. And I thought, maybe that's how cycles end, not with punishment, but with understanding repeated enough to change the soil. Would you have done the same? Would you have let go not to forget, but to redirect? Sometimes mercy feels heavier than anger. If you've ever felt that kind of silence, tell me below. When Evan arrived this next morning, he looked smaller somehow. The arrogance had burned off, leaving the raw outline of a man unarmored. He stared at the paper on the table, the volunteer hours, the conditions, the cost. "I'll do it," he said quietly. Then softer, I was jealous. This house, it was never mine. Not really. I looked at him not as a mother this time, but as a woman who had rebuilt herself from fractures. "You could have asked to belong," I said. He nodded, eyes wet but steady. I didn't know how. I watched his hand hover above the chipped cup, almost touching it. And for the first time, I didn't pull it away. Because healing isn't about who deserves it. It's about who's ready to carry it differently. When the rain eased, I walked him to the door. He turned back once the way children do when they're afraid they've lost the way home. I didn't wave. I just smiled and said, "The house remembers Evan. Take care of what you build next." He nodded, then stepped into the mist, and in that thin space between guilt and grace, I felt something shift, the kind of quiet that doesn't erase but rewrites. That night I brewed jasmine tea. Steam rose in soft curls, touching the air like forgiveness learning to breathe. The wooden hammer from the workshop tapped softly on the bench, slow, rhythmic, patient. It sounded almost like a heartbeat. I thought of all the years I'd mistaken kindness for surrender, silence for peace. But I know better now. Peace has edges. Peace protects. Peace chooses what to rebuild and what to release. The house was warm again. I could almost hear it whisper through the beams. The house remembers what we forget. And I whispered back, yes, but I remember too. Justice had found its place, not in courts or signatures, but in boundaries wrapped with compassion. Forgiveness conditional, family disciplined, life continuous. The cup cooled beside me, old porcelain thin, but unbroken. Outside, the rain had stopped and dawn was finding its way through the blinds. The world smelled clean, hard as oak, soft as warm tea. The morning light was soft, the kind that drifts, not shines. Mist lifted slowly from the Astoria River, peeling away like gauze from a healing wound. I opened the kitchen window, and the smell of wet wood slipped in tender forgiving. Sunlight struck the porcelain shards on my table, the ones I had refused to throw away. For weeks they waited quiet witnesses to what was broken, but not gone. Now a thin brush of gold trembled in my hand. When the lacquer met the crack, it glowed a vein of fire across pale blue. I could almost hear it breathe. Each stroke felt like stitching my own heart one careful line at a time. I whispered, "You've held tea and tears. You've earned your scars." The house was silent, but the silence was kind. Healing, I've learned, isn't about hiding what hurt. It's about giving it meaning. Mia sat beside me, her chin barely reaching the table edge. She watched the gold lines bloom with awe. "Grandma," she asked, "why don't we just buy a new one?" I smiled. "Because the cracks tell the story of how it was healed." She nodded, though I could tell she didn't fully understand. "One day she will. We all do when life teaches us to live with visible grace." Laura called mid-morning. Her voice was calmer than I remembered, the sharp edges softened by time and effort. "Mom," she said, "we've finished moving. Evan's working again. We'd like to have you over for dinner on Sunday, if you'd like." There was a pause, deliberate, respectful. They asked this time, not assumed. It was a small sentence, but to me, it felt like an apology carved into air. "Would you have accepted, after betrayal, after silence, after all that storm? If you've ever stood at the border between forgiveness and fear, tell me below." I told her yes, not for forgetting, but for beginning again. After I hung up, I walked to the porch. The old railing creaked beneath my palm. I ran my fingers along the wood grain still scarred from the years of salt wind. Underneath it was strong like me. The house murmured in the warmth, a sound between sigh and memory. "The house remembers what we forget," I whispered. And for once, I wasn't afraid of what it remembered. Later, I opened my desk drawer and found the new trust document Delgado helped me create. My name written steady and sure at the top. The house would now belong to a foundation protected purposeful with the right of residence reserved for me for life. No more forged signatures, no more borrowed truths. My legacy sealed not by anger, but by clarity. As I read through the pages, sunlight touched the gold seams of the repaired cup beside me. It shimmered quiet, proud, unashamed. That's when I realized kintsugi isn't just art. It's the sound of the soul deciding to keep living. In the afternoon, I brewed tea. Jasmine again, the scent of my mother's kitchen long ago. The kettle whistled slow and steady, like a breath returning after too long held. I poured the tea into the golden-mended cup and placed it on the window ledge. Steam curled upward, carrying the faintest reflection of gold into the sunlight. The air hummed with a peace I didn't have to earn anymore. Forgiveness is not a gift for others. It's the architecture of your own freedom. Sometimes mercy rebuilds what justice only fractures. Sometimes love survives by changing shape. The floorboards creaked beneath me as I moved through each room, not as ghosts, but as guardians. Every scratch, every stain, every corner had a voice now. This was the same kitchen from the first chapter of my story, same walls, same view, same woman. But the light had changed. It was warmer, wider, as if the house itself had exhaled. Would you have done the same, rebuilt the broken with gold instead of rage? Share this if you believe even the cracked can shine again. Evening came gently. I heard footsteps on the gravel, Mia laughing in the yard, chasing the wind. Her laughter filled the silence that used to ache. I turned off the lights and let dusk settle in cool and blue. Somewhere between tea and twilight, peace arrived, not loud, not perfect, but whole. I carried the cup to the doorway. The gold lines glowed in the dim light, soft like veins under skin. I placed it on the ledge right where the morning would find it again. Inside, the air smelled of jasmine and polished wood. Outside, the river shimmered in the distance, silver, steady, forgiving. I touched the column by the door, the same one I'd held on the night everything broke. Now it felt different, warm, alive, familiar. The house hummed again, almost a whisper. The house remembers what we forget. I smiled. Yes, but we remember how to live. I closed my eyes and listened, not for pain, not for fear, but for stillness. It was there, steady as breath. I thought of gold veins, laughter, and quiet mornings, of second chances written in light, of a life no longer borrowed but truly mine. The cracks were shining, and so was I. Vet nut sang, Longan sang, the cracks shine, and so does peace.